Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Pallet, and thanks for being with us. Today, I'm joined by Joe Greene, one of our staff writers and election experts, to unpack some of our exciting new research about how states report election results differently. If you've paid much attention to elections, and if you're listening to this podcast, I'm guessing you have, then you likely may have wondered at times why some states report election results at different speeds. So much of our information availability in today's world is faster than it used to be. The 24-hour news cycle, collegiate acceptance decisions, sporting event results. But when it comes to elections, states don't all count and process ballots at the same speed. And the reasons why are a little more complicated than they might seem. For instance, in some places, unofficial election results are nearly complete by the end of Election Day. In others, it can take election officials days or even weeks to finish the count. Behind the scenes, policies around ballot deadlines, early voting, pre-processing rules, and election resources all shape the timeline. So the factors that slow down or speed up ballot counting come into sharp focus when comparing two of our largest states, California and Florida. They have a high level of early and mail voting, but dramatically different reporting speeds. Their approaches offer a window into the broader trade-offs between delivering fast results and understanding what impacts the public trust in the elections that we participate in. So let's dig into all the information. Joe, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Jeff. Happy to be here.
Yeah, we're right in the thick of sports playoff season, so this timing feels appropriate because this is right when you want results fast. You want to know if your team won or your team lost, and election results are just like that, right? Just a sport of a different color, I guess, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, let's kind of dig in. So, at a high level, how does the process of counting ballots and reporting unofficial election results typically work across the country?
Yeah, I think a good starting point is sort of disambiguating a couple of different kinds of ballots. The process looks different in each state depending on the type of ballot that an election official is processing and counting. The biggest distinction, which holds true across all 50 states, is just ballots voted in person at a polling location on election day and essentially every other ballot. So that would include absentee mail-in ballots that are mailed, that are delivered by mail, absentee mail-in ballots that are delivered in person, early ballots that are voted in person, early ballots that might be delivered through a different method. You kind of get into some terminology differences between states there. But yeah, the big distinction is ballots cast on election day and ballots cast before election day, or just in a format that's not that in-person polling place ballot. And the reason you got to separate out those two big groups and there's sort of the subgroups that I mentioned for the latter group of ballots is that they require different things of election administrators. Essentially, to boil it down, really, get rid of a little bit of the complexity at the start here. I know we'll get a little bit more into this, but the big difference is ballots that are cast in person at a polling location on election day require a lot less work of election officials than those other types of ballots. That's because there's structures put in place to verify a voter's identity on the day of an election. There's chain of custody and security protocols that don't apply to ballots that are voted in person. Essentially, there's just a lot more work to do on those other types of ballots. It's a greater load on election administrators and officials. It takes more time to process all those ballots. And then, yeah, there's a whole suite of policies related to processing those ballots, counting those ballots, releasing election results that are not present for those in-person on election day ballots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about elections in the country, which are decentralized, a theme we've talked about a lot in the show. It's up to the states to administer their elections, and in some cases, even up to the local jurisdictions. So is there any simple explanation as to why the way results are reported can vary so widely?
Yeah, definitely. So from that starting point, just the number of ballots that are cast before the election, there's a series of other factors that come into play. The biggest one is probably the pre-processing policies for those ballots. When can election officials begin to take the steps required to process and count an absentee mail-in ballot? And that's where we see a huge range across all 50 states. I think the earliest date is 35 days before an election in North Carolina.
Yeah, so what does that mean to pre-process a ballot? Like, what let's walk our listeners through what that actually means.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where we get to have some fun with the consequences of having a decentralized election administration system in the United States. Is processing actually means something else, something different, or something unique
Right.
in all 50 states. There's obviously a lot of overlap in what processing means, but specifically what is defined as processing changes state to state. Some of the big things here would literally be just like opening the envelope for an absentee mail-in ballot, verifying the signature on that ballot, matching a ballot number to the ballot number of the ballot that was originally sent to that voter. So making sure the voter actually voted the ballot that was sent to them. Not something that's required in every state, but might be required in some places. There's also, in some states, pre-processing might include scanning ballots, which gets into the territory of tabulation, which is actually a different thing, a different part of the process. And in other states, you can't scan, you just gotta collect ballots in a certain place. So you get into the weeds a little bit. Some states with pre-processing might allow like all ballots that are pre-processed to be collected in one place so that when they are allowed to count those ballots, they can do so quickly. They basically just have to run it through a machine, or they just hit a tally button that counts up ballots that have already been scanned. Elsewhere, pre-processing might be limited to just those first steps, opening the envelope, ensuring that the ballot has a signature, those sorts of steps. So yeah, can mean a lot of different things in a lot of different places, but essentially
Yeah.
just think about getting that ballot ready, making sure that ballot was valid and legitimately cast before it's actually counted.
Okay, so what are some other factors that play into the election result processing speed?
So we got into tabulation a little bit there. Again, it's sort of down to different definitions of processing, different definitions of tabulation in different states. Tabulation really is a separate process from pre-processing ballots. And what the process of tabulation looks like in each state is a little bit differently. So in a state where tabulation can occur simultaneously with pre-processing or immediately after pre-processing, you might see quicker results, just for example, because there's not sort of an initial step and then a pause and then a second step. One piece of work flows directly into the next piece of work that's required to release unofficial election results, get all those ballots counted, and get those results released. Tabulation policies as well. So not only refers to how and when, but even like deadlines for when tabulation has to happen by. Oftentimes we're talking about sort of dates when these activities can be started, particularly with pre-processing. Some states have deadlines for when this work needs to be completed. That's not as common, but that it can be a significant factor in quicker election results. And just a note on terminology there too, the quicker, slower, we're really talking about, again, the delivery of unofficial results when you see sort of, if you're watching CNN or Fox on election day and you're seeing down at the bottom of the screen that 90% reported, that number is what we're talking about. In some states, that number gets up to that 90% threshold pretty quick. It's sort of an arbitrary threshold just for the sake of this conversation. But yeah, in other states, it takes a long time to get there.
Yep.
In addition to tabulation, I'll keep going if that's okay.
Yeah. Rip through 'em. What else next?
Resources is a big one, and we tried to get into this a little bit in the report that we're sort of referencing here in this podcast. This is a really hard one to draw out sort of empirical takeaways on looking at different states, but this is clearly a major factor in how quickly ballots are counted. We're talking about the number of machines, for example. So imagine a state that has two states that have the same number of ballots, and they're using the same machines to tabulate those ballots. The state that's got more machines is going to tabulate those ballots more quickly. Just that simple sort of equation. The same holds true for other resource factors like number of election officials, even the number of election officials or volunteers that are directly working on parts of the ballot counting process, like pre-processing, like tabulation. And there's other resource factors as well, such as how many locations, and even questions like, are all ballots counted in a centralized location or are they counted in precincts? And what does that breakdown look like? Um, a, a really interesting one is absentee mail-in deadlines. We'll get into this a little bit more in California, the California and Florida comparison, where this is a factor that likely plays a significant role in the discrepancy between the release of unofficial results in both states. But yeah, it obviously pre-processing requires a lot of time, requires a lot of effort from election officials, can slow down that release of unofficial results. So if you've got ballots that are arriving up to a week, up to 10 days, up to 2 weeks after an election, obviously you're not going to get results on those ballots until election administrators have had time to process them, verify the validity of those ballots, and then release those results.
Right. So, okay. So let's recap where we're at. We've got number of ballots before the election, and then there's the pre-processing policies, the tabulation policies and reporting requirements, and then the kind of resources, basically the amount of money, the amount of labor, the amount of personnel you're putting into handling all the vote counting, then the absentee mail-in deadlines. What's next for the other factors that are going to tie into this?
So these are some, I would consider these not minor factors because they might play a really important role in certain elections or in certain states, but provisional ballot rules, cure processing rules, and hand count jurisdictions kind of round out our suite of factors there. Again, just the reason why these are not as significant of a factor in most states and in most elections is just that the overall number of these ballots typically sits around. So provisional ballots typically in like the 1 to 3% of all ballots cast in election range. Curable ballots is usually in a sort of similar ballpark. And again, that's a sort of broad generalization. Those numbers change a lot state to state, but they're typically less than 5% of ballots, both of those types of ballots combined in a given election. So, yep. In each of those types of ballots, as well as it's just important to note, the reason why they lead to slower results is they require, in addition to like processing that absentee mail-in ballots required, provisional ballots and curable ballots require even more administrative steps to either verify the identity of a voter or contact a voter and give them an opportunity to respond and fix a curable deficiency, for example. So there's just a time component there that slows down when those types of ballots themselves will be counted. It's very rare for the bulk of those ballots to be counted by election day, certainly not before election day. And hand count jurisdiction. So this is one that in a state with a lot of jurisdictions that count ballots by hand, this might be a significant factor. I believe New Hampshire is the state where with the most individual jurisdictions that hand count ballots. Typically, those jurisdictions are on the smaller side with 1,000 or fewer voters. And yeah, you can imagine there are ballot tabulating machines that can scan and tabulate thousands of ballots per minute. That sort of speed is just not possible when a jurisdiction is hand counting. Obviously, with enough resources, you could probably get close. But yeah, it would just take a lot more to hand count ballots that quickly.
Yeah, so let's dig into the case study we did. So we could spend years talking about all 50 states trying to compare them, but we specifically focused on Florida and California. So talk a little bit about why we chose those two states here.
Yeah, the Florida and California are sort of the archetypical fast and slow states, at least right now. The obviously that can change. It's sort of designation or understanding of a state's ballot counting speed can change if a state implements policies or tweaks how they count ballots. Florida's a great example of that. We can get a little bit more into that as we go. But yeah, Florida delivers nearly complete election results shortly after the polls close on election night. California is at the other end of the spectrum, oftentimes not reaching a similar level of unofficial results reported until weeks after election day. So they're sort of the natural, and again, you mentioned this in the intro as well. They're both two of our biggest states here in the United States. They play an outsized role culturally, so they're kind of sitting there and offering a neat comparison when looking at this specific topic.
It comes up often as a natural comparison set of states. I mean, their governors got into a little debate last year, so we're not the first ones to make the comparison. So Well, let's dig a little deeper then onto it. So talk a little about some of those distinctions on, say, reporting deadlines on election day itself between Florida and California.
Sure. So a major factor, I think, actually, not to take your question a different way, but to take it a little bit of a different way, it's helpful to talk about similarities between the two states as well, because they're actually very similar on a couple of those marquee factors that we would take a sort of initial look at to try and understand how long ballot counting would take. And that's just the prevalence of ballots cast before election day and pre-processing policies. In California, upwards of 80%, I think in 2024, it was near 87% actually, of ballots cast in the election were absentee mail-in ballots. That's largely because California is what we call an all-mail voting state, where all eligible and active registered voters receive an absentee mail-in ballot automatically for every election that they're eligible to vote in. So it just leads to a higher prevalence, or just a high general prevalence of absentee mail-in voting. Florida also crossed the 80% threshold in absentee mail-in voting and early in-person voting. This again gets into just states doing things a little bit differently. Florida reports those sort of like those groups of ballots together. California does not, and they actually do not report a number of in-person early voted ballots, and a lot of those voters may actually be factored in as having voted an absentee mail-in ballot. So it's just sort of a terminology difference. The underlying point there is that a significant majority of ballots in both states are cast before election day. And the next topic there are pre-processing policies. Another point where both states are actually fairly similar and are on sort of the more permissive end of the spectrum for pre-processing. California allows election officials to begin pre-processing absentee mail-in ballots 29 days before an election. Florida, there's a little bit of disagreement here, but about how early it can actually start. But sort of the floor is 25 days. They can start counting ballots at least 25 days before an election. Again, if you're looking at all 50 states, both of those dates are on the earlier side. So they give election administrators plenty of time to take all those administrative steps required of absentee mail-in ballots. So just from that sort of general starting point, the states are pretty similar. Where things start to get different is that third factor we talked about, which is tabulation and reporting requirements. Um, so in California, election officials can actually scan ballots that they've pre-processed. So there's not a separate step to tabulate ballots. I mean, there is, but it's more or less a sort of pro forma, click the button, the ballot's already been scanned. Election officials don't need to handle all of those ballots a second time. They just need to sort of hit the button that tallies up the vote counts. Um, Similar in Florida, ballots can be tabulated in advance, but that sort of tally is not executed until election day, and those results are not released until after the polls close. The big difference here is a statutory reporting requirement in Florida that does not exist in California. Florida requires election officials to finish the count of all absentee mail-in ballots by election day. There's a little bit of wiggle room in the statutory language, but election officials are more or less required to finish counting all of those ballots that were voted before the election by the close of polls and deliver those results almost right away after polls close. In California, that requirement doesn't exist, and there's another factor that draws out that counting process quite a bit that does not exist in Florida, which is the return deadline for absentee mail-in ballots. In Florida, all those ballots must be returned by election day to be counted in election. In California, ballots that are postmarked by election day will be counted if they're otherwise valid, as long as they were received by the 7th day after election day. And we actually spoke to some people in California about this and tried to get them to confirm this number. They couldn't confirm or deny it. So take that sort of qualification as you may. But in 2024 in California, up to nearly 40% or more of ballots counted in the election arrived after election day. So if you just think about the administrative burden there, you're talking about
Mm.
potentially millions of ballots that election administrators need to process, need to verify signatures on, potentially needs to contact voters to alert them of curable deficiencies. About all of that is happening after the polls have closed on election day in California, whereas in Florida, the 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 ballot boxes have been closed. Those ballots have already been counted, and those results just naturally are going to be released quicker. And again, yeah, that statutory requirement. And Florida is unique in that regard. Also, other states do have statutory reporting requirements similar to Florida, but it's definitely the exception, not the rule. And yeah, oftentimes we just see a more informal process with election officials releasing those tallies when they have them, not being required by law to release them at a specific time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's been, what's getting me thinking about, and this is not part of our report, but it makes you wonder about something like a cost or time to process per ballot, because what you're kind of describing is it just takes more time to process an absentee ballot that comes after polls closed or beforehand, or it might take more time if you have to do, things in multiple steps. And of course, when it comes to anything, time is also the equivalent of money. How much staff do you have to pay in order to do it? How much time does it take those staff members? I don't know if it was actually ever tried to calculate that kind of a comparison point, but
Yeah.
that would be a pretty interesting way to compare the different states, is to see, what kind of, economies of scale are they, seeing in, say, California versus Rhode Island, but also in terms of just like, because of the process, that the time and cost per ballot to process it. So
We tried sort of working around the edges on this question for part of this report. A big challenge here is just the availability of data, and then also just the comparability of data state to state. We've already talked about this sort of with respect to terminology. Um, but states record different data with respect to their elections than other states.
yep.
There are federally mandated reporting requirements for certain topics within elections, and most of that goes through the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, which is a great data source for a lot of this stuff. But yeah, it's really, and that's something I think it's one of our takeaways from this analysis and from this report also, is that there's a lot more digging there, and there's a lot more clarity that can be provided as well.
Yeah.
But there's there's a lot of work doing too.
Just from like a general scheduling perspective, what I'm hearing from your sort of case study comparison is, if you are an election administrator in California, you probably like take a little bit of time off before the election and then prepare for like overtime in the 2 weeks after that.
Oh
And if
yeah,
you're in Florida, you put in a ton of overtime before the election. And then like the day
and you're
after the election, you can go take your vacation then. So they're on
yeah.
totally different like work schedules in some respects. And just kind of really is an interesting way to visualize and compare the states. So what else is there that we should talk about that are differences between the two states and their systems for election results reporting?
Yeah, resources is really the one, and we're kind of talking about it right now. It's sort of that a little bit of a black box still, but clearly a hugely important factor in the release of election results and when that happens. And it's just not a topic where there's a lot of hard data out there, but it's sort of tantalizing in the sense that there's going to be answers there. There's going to be solutions there as well for states that might want to speed up their release of unofficial election results. And I think it's also just important to qualify the idea of quicker election results. And we get into this a little bit in the reports. I would direct listeners of the podcast to the report for sources and sort of more fleshed out arguments here. But one of the reasons California counts and releases election results a little bit more slowly is an intentional choice, trying to afford voters more time to correct ballot deficiencies, trying to give election administrators more time to ensure the accuracy of the tabulation that they've done and the results that they've compiled. So there are arguments sort of against just outright prioritizing quicker results. But I think in general, you hit on this in your lead in, Jeff. A lot of times voters are just not really sure why things are taking so long. They went and did their part on election day. They got their ballot in by election day in states that might accept ballots afterwards. So it's not always clear why it's taking so much time, but there are reasons why election administrators sort of would argue against trying to just speed up the delivery of results. But I think the case study of Florida shows that it's certainly possible to speed up the delivery of unofficial results without sort of jeopardizing the accuracy and integrity of the election results themselves. And Florida's change to quicker election results really came after the 2000 election as well.
Yeah, the hanging chads, right?
Yep, exactly.
Yep.
There was sort of an overhaul of the state's election policies that came after 2000. And one of the things that that policymakers really tried to prioritize was quicker but accurate election results. That they did everything from changing the type of machines that they were using to implementing those sorts of tabulation requirements that guaranteed the delivery of quicker unofficial results. And not to go too deep down the rabbit hole here of sort of different terminology and aspects of the post-election process here, but I think it's important to just mention canvassing and certification. They're just two other terms that you hear a lot after an election. And we're not talking about either of those processes here. Canvassing is basically when election officials, they've compiled their election results and they're going to go take a second look, more or less. That's my way of simplifying what a canvass is. They've got their results. They're going to double check that the number of ballots lines up. If there's any discrepancy in the number of ballots cast and the number of ballots counted, they're going to try and track that down, resolve that issue. They're going to take a second look at question ballots, challenged ballots, different subgroups of ballots, et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't have anything to do with that initial step of counting and delivering unofficial results. And then the certification as well is the moment when unofficial results become official. That typically happens anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks. And again, it depends on the state and state laws after the election, and happens after the canvass too.
Yep.
Those in all 50 states are statutorily derived process or determined process, I should say, not derived, where there are very specific dates associated with both processes in almost every state's laws. That's not true of just the counting process. Although most states, even in California, for example, they don't have that tabulation requirement to deadline that Florida has, but they do have reporting requirements still that require election officials to intermittently release results when they have them. Basically, that don't allow them to hold on to results, more or less, but they don't require them to actually finish counting by a certain point. So,
Well, great. This has been really fun to talk through, Joe. And for listeners, if you haven't seen the report on Ballotpedia already, you can find the link to it in show notes, where we kind of go through all the various different factors and compare the two states in sort of exquisite detail. And we'll be back later this week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Hallett, and thanks for listening.